Good afternoon and welcome back to Tronos for the 2020 At the Fringe Festival. It's the stay-at-home edition, so I'm here this afternoon in Tronos with Lucy Durneen, who is going to give us the second episode of the Passion for Words series, and we have a very small, socially distant audience here in the room. So I'm going to hand over to Lucy, who might explain to us what is a lyric essay.
Thank you very much, Dom. Thanks for having me here in this beautiful Tronos today to talk about something that I am a little bit evangelical about at the moment. This discovery I've made in the last couple of years of being a writer of the lyric essay. And it's a term that very often when I tell people that I'm really into writing these lyric essays now, everyone will say, well, what even is a lyric essay? What does it even mean? And I think to begin with, I'm going to start with a couple of definitions, very imperfect definitions, possibly even just perspectives more than actual definitions of things, but taking apart these two ideas, the lyric and the essay. Now, the essay is probably something that we've encountered first at school. We probably have horrible memories of being made to write essays that have to have a hypothesis, they have to have an argument, they have to have a conclusion. But there's something more limited than the lyric essay can actually allow us to explore. And the other half of the question here is the lyric side, the poetic side. And I want to think about two specific aspects of what these words actually even mean, where they're taking us. And one is that the essay itself, the word essay means to try, to attempt, to test. It's an aspect of essaying that I think we forget, going back to our school history of sort of being required to put an argument on paper, that we're actually exploring something, we're actually trying to get to the bottom of something. It's quite a creative and curious impulse that we have in writing an essay. The other half of this, the lyric, the poetic side, comes back to an idea that I think is expressed really well by the poet Diane Ackerman. She has a brilliant essay on poetry, a lyric essay about the lyric essay effectively, where she says that one of the most surprising things about human beings is that we require a poetic version of life. So we have these two kind of impulses coming together. One is the need to find a poetic explanation or depth to the life we're experiencing, and the other is this desire to find a way to express it and to investigate it and to bring it into some kind of recognizable shape. What I love about the lyric essay is that you have these two really robust, complex, curious forms butting heads against each other. The essay is kind of forward thrust of wanting to come to a conclusion, and the poem's obliquity and obscurity. The idea that we might want to ask a question about something and say, hey, I want to know more about this. I want to understand how something works. And the other angle, the poet's angle, coming in and saying, I want to know about that stuff too, but I don't want to give it away to you just yet. So in school, we might have been asked to write an essay, for example, about the impact of shark fishing on the natural balance of the oceans. And we might have to research, and we might have to come up with an argument, and we might have to steer ourselves towards a conclusion. But then the lyric essay asks us, or allows us to ask ourselves, why might I be interested in shark fishing and the impact of its balance on ocean life? Why might I actually care about this? Why might it matter to me? And just as with poetry, which is a form that allows us to be vulnerable and asks us to delve into the self and come to some sort of or go on some kind of journey through the self, we can start to look at why we're even asking the questions that the essay is demanding of us. Why am I interested? And this is the question that I started to come to when I began to write lyric essays of my own. And the essay that I particularly want to have a talk about today is very much in progress, but it is about sharks. It's partly about the impact of shark fishing on the balance of the oceans, but it's also about something else. Because when I started to realize that this was something I was interested in, following a trip to the fjords of Musandam in the it's a peninsula of Oman. When I started to ask myself why this mattered to me, I began to realize poetry, the sort of tendrils of poetry started to sort of creep in and demand that I ask something else of this question, which was, why does it matter? Why do I care? And I realized that there were some underlying questions that this shark fishing started to awaken in me. When I was in Oman traveling, I saw the impact of the aftermath, you might say, of shark fishing. And the thing that I carried away with me was the sight of boatfuls of sharks and the blood of the sharks and the bodies of the sharks in being loaded onto the wharves. And I found myself really affected by the sight of this, but I couldn't quite understand why I was being particularly affected by something that I was actually quite distant from. I was on a boat, it was far away from me, I couldn't quite see what was happening. But something about the behavior of sharks, something about the futility of their experience, something about seeing how helpless they were lying on the wharves began to get me to ask questions of myself. And I began to connect this experience with the loss of my child. My baby was stillborn, and I was still trying to explore my response to this question and to the desire to have children and the desire to perpetuate life, and all of these big questions that actually I didn't really know what to do with in real life, but I began to ask them within the framework of an essay. And I know there are some people who like to see things in the form of charts, and there are some people who are not entirely convinced that charts can explain what poetry is doing. But if you can see a little chart here on the screen, this is a sort of a cross-section of my thoughts writing this essay at any one time. The random stuff that's going through my mind, and it's divided here into sharks, into the idea of translation. I was thinking at the time about how we translate experiences from one form into another. I was thinking a lot about blood, a bit gruesome. I was thinking about fertility. I was thinking about snorkeling, which was actually what I was doing at the point that I first saw these sharks. In that very kind of distracted way that modern life brings to us, I was thinking about what was happening on Twitter. I was reading Heidegger and learning for the first time about the idea of Lichtung, the idea of illumination, light coming through trees and exposing something that we could begin to sort of form into conscious thought. I was beginning to think about why Heidegger is so difficult to understand and whether someone could possibly explain him to me, if only that was possible. And the more I started to look at sharks, I realized they were actually super interesting. I had all of these thoughts floating around in my head, and I didn't know what to do with them. But the lyric essay is a form that allows you to do many, many things at one time, because you're working in this beautiful in-between space, this space between poetry and between the question of how and why and what does any of this mean. The lyric essayist John Degata says that it's in this in-between space that the most truthful struggles with reality actually exist. It's in that space between one state and another that we really start to grapple with emotional truths and the truths of life. So it seems like a really, really good space to begin to ask difficult questions. But the beautiful thing about the lyric essay is by operating in an in-between space between what we might think of as fact, creative non-fiction, hypothesis, argument, and poetry, which is by necessity obscure and multifaceted. We're working in a space that almost defies the need to verify fact. We can bring in the personal. We can bring in the felt rather than just the known. So we're able to collide two different aspects of experience, the things that we can empirically verify and the things that we just know in our gut and our heart. And we don't have to come to the same kind of defined conclusions, but we can come to some kind of emotional truth that in Degata's words is somehow more truthful because it's coming at it from a place that's sort of very internal. For some people, this is a difficult area, it's a sort of a tricky thing to reconcile oneself with, because if it's not verified fact, how can we say it's true? How do we know what we're reading is something that we can rely on? But Degatta goes on to talk about how it's in that sort of in-between state that it's the most interesting space. Things that can't be verified fully and empirically are actually often a lot more interesting than those things that can. So we can come close to a truth, even if we don't necessarily fully expose it in some way. To illustrate the point a little bit, I'm going to read from a section of a lyric essay that I'm writing in progress about these sharks. And in the program for this particular slot, I had, I think, possibly disingenuously talked about shrimps who have their heart in their head. I talked about aspects of this essay that involve the desire for children. I had talked about Heidegger. And the parts of this essay that I'm going to read and to share don't actually include any of those things yet, because they're still kind of in the in-between space that I haven't quite figured out how to make the connections with. But I wanted to share something that is still in the process of being braided together. What the lyric essay allows us to do from these sort of two spectrums of poetry and feeling and truth and fact is to braid together all of these different nebulous ideas, sharks and Heidegger and blood and snorkeling and what's going on Twitter, and why is the shark actually a much more gentle, maternal, interesting creature than perhaps Hollywood, Jaws and social media have had us believe. So I'm going to start with the opening section of this essay, where I'm beginning to set up some of the questions that I'm going to try and get close to as I work through it. The essay is called My Love is a Shark. It starts this way. They set sail at noon when the sun was a halo of glass and the sky nothing but bright, hot light. Below the Hajar mountains was the smooth jade tongue of the fjord. The light opened and closed inside it like tissue paper petals, flaring. The light made the girl feel alive and sad because she was travelling alone. And what she was longing for, one of the things, was to look out at the mountains, at the way this light rippled up them like the trail of a very small, very fast animal, and to slip a hand into the hand of someone who was there, someone who weeks later would also still marvel at how shadows could move like living things. It didn't have to be mountains. It was about looking into another person's face and seeing something step into the space between them, something desperate and true that said, I understand you, which is what Orwell said was all anyone really wanted. Loneliness made her talkative. She would talk to the other travellers or to the waves, it didn't matter. There was the creak and spit of water at the belly of the dhow, the waves doing their best to change the broken rhythms of her heart. No, this is the pattern, the waves were saying. Like this, my love, like this. The dhow, lined with bright red kilims, had a bow that rose to a sharp point like the plastic swordfish her daughter liked to play with in the bath. Soft-skinned girls in bikinis claimed its vantage point first. She watched them arching through selfies beside veiled women who choreographed impossible family shots, and the heart twist came again. It was not the view people wanted to capture, but the evidence of being in it, here, and not in the place where their normal lives were carrying on without them. There was a beautiful girl whose mother could not return to Tehran. There was an art restorer from Oregon. There was a doctor and a nurse on day leave from a medical evacuation. The nurse was seasick. The doctor stripped to his shorts and dove from the boat into the cool sea, then surfaced, seal sleek, beckoning all of them but the nurse down. They snorkeled through the Kfar Ash-Sham. Scrambled rocks held their knees to their chests and jumped. All day she shimmered between elements. You were either sicky and hot or submerged. It felt good to be in a place where the choices were so simple. A dolphin passed them, although not everyone agreed this was what it was. There were strangers suddenly behaving as friends, swimming and scrambling and jumping and crashing into the green water like stars. There was a group of children who had caught a small dogfish and were watching it die on the deck, slick and wet against fat green cushions, gasping its savage way out of the world. The children danced around as the dogfish made useless, looping efforts to live, its fins backbending as if clapping on its own end. The art restorer took photographs with his Nikon, and in the distance, the fjord leered out of sight. The mountains looked fake, painted onto a violent, deep horizon. Only the dogfish seemed real. Later, when they were back out on open water, black shadows of other sharks gathered below the boat to make vengeful passes back and forth through the shaking deep, or so she wanted to believe. So that's the first strand of the question that I wanted to start asking about this experience of seeing these sharks in Oman. The first question about the relationship between man and shark, between myself and the sharks that I could see. And although I tried to initially start writing this as a poem, actually, the experience initially came to me in the form of just the moment of seeing the sharks in the boat, and it felt to me as though the natural inclination was to take this into a poem, something condensed, something compressed, something distilled into a single isolated incident. But the more I started to try and capture it in the form of poetry, the less I seemed to actually be able to say about the whole experience and what it meant to me. Too much of it was in the subtextual layers, or sort of below the surface of the fjord, if you like. And that's when I started to realise that I had too many questions for it to be a poem. This was where this lovely, versatile and robust form of the lyric essay stepped into its own and allowed me to ask the questions without directly asking them. So the more research I did about sharks, the more I discovered that they're very individual creatures. They're not these personalityless, dead, cold animals that nature programs often show us that they are. They're individual. They have emotions. We know that sharks can feel anger, for example, and they demonstrate this in their movements and their diving patterns, their behavior with other sea creatures. And it struck me that actually there's quite a lot of comparison we might make between human emotion and the behavior that we see sharks exhibiting. So I started to take the essay into another direction. I started to take it into a direct consideration of the shark itself. So this is another section from the essay. This is another braid, if you like, another strand of an idea that I'm trying to bring together in this one essay. I'm skipping ahead, but I'm hoping that eventually this will tempt people to continue to read the whole piece. But skipping ahead to a passage about a shark itself. Consider the dwarf lantern shark, how its organs pulse light from its belly, camouflaging it in the dappled sandbanks with illumination rather than shadow. Imagine this tiny shark in the sun rays, how it becomes the light, slips inside such tiny radiant twisters as they sink slowly into the deep. From a distance, acts of desire can always be mistaken for acts of aggression. Here, at least, is a similarity between shark and man. There is threat in all of us, and we are all faintly luminous. Some days later, I'm reading Helen Oswald, who reminds me that the heart needs a dark space to thump undetected. Sometimes light is too much. Anyway, caustic is the word I'm thinking about when I think about a shark's skin. I'm reminded of how a couple of years ago, the internet made a collective lunge for graphic artist Brandon Rees, whose Twitter comic flippantly depicted sharks as the smooth lions of the sea. The smooth lions sound nice. I walk towards their defiant position, their willing contrariness, extending my hand. Checking again now, I see the Twitter thread responding to Rees's person who discovered sharks has more than 400 responses that feel differently. As a veteran scuba instructor, I have touched dozens of sharks with my bare hands. Every one had very rough skin, like medium sandpaper. There must be something wrong with your hands, Brandon Rees trolls back. I'm touching a shark right now, rubbing it every which way. No direction is off limits. It's smoother than the finest silks. The lyric essays in Betweenness allows us to shift registers. It allows us to, in this case, try to start with something that came close to travel writing, came close to some kind of pen portrait, if you like, of the scene that I was in, but allowed me to swerve off course into something that became a little bit more quotidian, something a little bit more of the everyday, something that instead of being detached and third person and observant becomes personal and reflective of what's going on in my own day. Because our experience of life, going back to this idea of Diane Ackerman, that we want a poetic version of life. We want to make sense of our daily grind in a way that makes it beautiful, in a way that makes it somehow universally understood. The lyric essay allows us to work with both of those registers and to bring them together, and to move between them with ease. We don't have to come out of the essay and start something new. We can shift. We can change our voice. We can almost act like a sort of a ventriloquist inhabiting the voice of something else in order to access a different part of the question that we're asking here. As the essay progressed, it became more personal, as essays tend to do. We turn to poetry when we want to explore more vulnerable aspects of ourselves. We turn to essays when we need to find answers to something. So it stands to reason in a way that the lyric essay is going to take us on a very personal journey to get to the answers of those questions. And I began to find myself going into places that I didn't expect to go. But as I started to go into those more personal spaces, I found I needed a kind of a distance from them. And once again, the essay allowed me to step backwards, to step into another thread, to step into another voice, and return to the third person. What her camera could not quite see. A fish eagle high above in the white sky. The spiny crabs like puckered pink scars zipping up the rocks. The art restorer from Oregon was slowly photographing the world, while back home his ex-wife organised their divorce papers. The nurse took seasickness tablets whose names were written in Arabic, and which everyone was fairly certain were only dubiously antiemetic. Over everything the sun, like someone had upturned a spoon of syrup and let it drip through the blurred sky. She swam and dived and basked in a silk shirt that a long-forgotten boyfriend had brought her from Hong Kong, over a bikini that claimed to be high-waisted, but still showed her stretch marks. They went that high. The unwanted announcement of her motherhood annoyed her, but then she would think, well, you could wear a one-piece. Such furious vanity. She'd done all the right things in pregnancy, cocoa butter she had not eaten for 2, but still, the pink silver marks had come. In the years after her marriage ended, she had catalogued a range of male responses to this. The quiet sighs hurt more than the suggestions of surgery. It's like a skin graft from an elephant, she told her best friend, who didn't believe her. One day, she pulled up her sweater to make the point, but they were in a bookstore at the time. It was things like this, she realised, that made her hard to love. For an hour, maybe, she had not thought about the fucking pain in her heart. But I do love it here on Earth, was what she was thinking. All these moments we're given to fall in love with. It was mostly not even about people. It was a lot about light. You could turn the moments over in your pocket like a prayer, the hot breath of jasmine on a Kirribilli street, the first bright, hot, hard flakes of a Scandinavian winter. Swimming naked in a creek in New South Wales with the full moon fat and low slung, skimming the waterline. Shit, not my cock, a man was saying, distantly, as clawed things rubbed up and down their legs. A memory hall, a dance hall of ghosts. You could get drunk on sunlight. The dhow moved from the fjord back into the strait. That phrase, ploughing the waves. Foam burst into the air, fine as corn dust. Then Telegraph Island retreated. Through closed eyelids, she kept smiling at the sun, like it was a friend making another legendary entrance to the party. Engine oil and salt and the scent of rose hips in her sun cream. Maybe none of this was real. Maybe it was a life she was inventing all about her just by thinking it. There was a lot of space around her these days, after all. There were the sounds of the kids dancing around the plastic box that now contained the half-dead dogfish. But her eyes stayed closed, because what did she know about the art of living? And then an argument. One of the boys was leaning too far over the dow's side. "This is deep water," the captain was shouting at his kid's father. "Deep water." He wouldn't leave it there. He was still shouting at the boys as they came into deeper port, where there were crowds of men on the dockside, the hems of their dishdasha skimming the stone dock, and white-gloved, red-gloved fishermen jumping from boat to boat. They saw the blood first, then the fins, the tails. The sharks heaped like discarded roses on the slipway, blousy and bursting open with their red-petalled wounds. Even with all the blood, it was the stillness of the sharks that was the most wrong thing about them. If you know only one fact about sharks, it is that they have to swim or die. She was hoping it was just the hot yammering that had begun at her temple, making her see things that weren't there. But they were there. Hammerheads and milk sharks, black tips, small motorboats viscous and slippery with blood and seawater. There was a whole orange bobbing against the sea wall. The thing about the in-between space of the essay is that although human beings are very naturally drawn to between spaces, we have a sort of a very relational approach to life in many ways and create between zones of meaning in order to make sense of things. It's not always somewhere we're very comfortable being. And I wonder, it's a question I think that the lyric essay makes us ask of ourselves: how comfortable are we in being in this space between fact and fiction, between poetry and something that might be more investigative, more discursive? How comfortable are we existing between two poles? Not everybody is. And I think it's part of the discomfort that drives the lyric essay forward. In order to work our way through it, in order to get out of that place where we feel a little bit uneasy, we have to keep pushing through the questions. We have to keep driving towards some kind of conclusion. So the essay that we would write at school, where we're always heading for that final synthesis of all of our ideas, the lyric essay gets us there in a different way. It carries us along on this sort of personal current, this current of poetry, this current of image, this current of discordant images braiding themselves together, whether that's sharks, blood, oranges, Heidegger, Lichtung. One idea leads to another. T.S. Eliot talked about the idea of the objective correlative, way that we sort of move through our ideas and our process of ideas like a sort of a word association game. One thought leads us to another thought that leads us to another thought, and they don't make a grammatical sense, but they make a kind of internal logical sense. And that's the kind of drive that the lyric essay is kind of carrying us along with. So when I started to write this essay, I didn't know that the sharks were going to take me to my own sense of loss of my child, and I didn't know they were going to take me towards a consideration of pregnancy and fertility. I didn't know they were actually going to take me to one final place, which was actually the consideration of the essay form itself. But to sort of give one last little excerpt from this essay in progress, I want to explain a little bit about how that fed into that bigger question of what the essay is actually trying to do. The tide always speaks in a future tense. Fishermen will set sail into the Strait of Hormuz through pale Musandam dawns. Spiny crabs will dash over the rocks. Tourists will swim and snorkel and dive. Sometimes there will be dolphins, a cliche of joy. Rumours of war will drift down the currents into the fjord. The sea will change quietly, now a strange amber near the shore, now muddied up with sediments and weed, with shrapnel and oil and blood. War has come to this essay. A strange, unknown virus is coming. The friend who saw her stretch marks in the bookshop will die. No one flies anymore. The waters around Oman turn green again with life. I thought I was writing an essay about love, but love is harder to describe than loss. Love is harder to describe than a shark, although it's easy to become obsessed with both things. Sometimes it has seemed to me we're most interested in beginnings, in footnotes, the things that do not make it to the narrative itself. I'm looking for the subject in the margins, in the clippings that fall to the archive floor. An essay is a bodily thing, a living thing. Like a shark, an essay has skin and teeth. An essay, like a shark, bleeds and fucks and bites and knows the pleasure of being inside another thing. Sentences, bodies, the sea. Along the blood-slick wharves of Deba, the fishermen yelled, "No pictures, no pictures." But the art restorer from Oregon silently took pictures, because since the camera was invented, this is how we have proved we're alive, by watching the death throes of the world through a lens. An essay slips between tenses, between then and now, shallows and trench, between speculation and observation, the concealed and the unconcealed. An essay cries out to be touched, to have its cold edge smoothed by words that correct everything, moves down into the depths, lightens them, wants to see and be seen. I'm trying to be the shark. There are lots of examples in literature of women turning into panthers, foxes. So often this is what women have to do, become something else in order to show the world the thing that they really are. There's a lovely quote I saw very recently on the lyric essay, which described the process of essaying as sculpting information. And to me, that feels a very, very natural way of expressing it, because for me, the lyric essay is about having a scattered pile of ideas that need to be shaped into something that becomes recognizable. So the idea of sculpting it seems to be the most appropriate word to use. The idea that only when we come to the end of the essay will we begin to fully understand what it was about, what it was trying to ask, and what questions it might actually have resolved. Often, like poetry, the answer is in that subtextual space. It's in the white space, it's in the gaps between things. And because the lyric essay is less concerned with resolution than perhaps the essays that we're used to, it's concerned with curiosity, and it's concerned with the process and the open road of the journey, if you like. Sometimes, even at the very end of the essay, we're only just beginning to understand the questions that we have been trying to ask. This essay that I'm reading from is still very much a work in progress. I'm reading fragments. I'm trying to still understand the braids that are going to pull it all together, although I can sense them as I'm writing it. I wanted to share it because, in a way, I think talking about the process helps us understand what the process is. And exposing the fragments helps us see how we can sculpt them into the whole. I think that for me, the lyric essay has become a form that has offered possibilities that other literary forms I've explored don't quite. I write short stories, I write poetry, but there's something about the lyric essay which enables me to really let go of the need to know where I'm going, to let go of the sense of control and constraint that other forms tend to have. And that's what I find particularly exciting about them. It's that desire to find the poetic version of life, but also to somehow shape that desire into a question of sorts, and to offer the readers the chance to step in and find the answers with us as well.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you for breaking down the elements of a lyric essay. It was really interesting. You know, I was seized by that argument about something that is so factual as the tangible stroking of skin, and the argument about that sense. And I think we've been very privileged here today that you have allowed us to experience some of those threads in sharing your work with us. And we will have had an experience of each of those threads from your extracts, which will be different to the final braiding that we will experience later when the essay is finished. So it's great to have another event here in Tronos. Tomorrow, Passion for Words will be featuring myself in conversation with Martin Holm and Litsa Denkovic. So we'll see you at the next event. Thank you.
Thank you.